Never in all her long history had London made such lavish preparation as she did for the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. The streets and buildings were gaily decorated, and everywhere in London there was an air of excitement and expectancy. For many days before the great occasion, the decorations proved an irresistible draw for thousands of visitors to the capital. Among the many distinguished guests from overseas was the Sultan of Zanzibar with his wife and daughter. By air from East Africa came the Kabaka of Uganda, accompanied by some of his advisors. Aboard the SS Rangitoto was Queen Salote, paying her first visit to Great Britain from the far distant Pacific island of Tonga. By air came a detachment of troops and police from the West Indies. These men were to march in the great procession on Coronation Day. And into Southampton Harbour steamed the liner Empire Trooper, carrying troops and police from the Southeast Asian territories. The detachment was delighted, as were they all, to be in Britain to march at the head of the great procession. At Woolwich, under the watchful eye of their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Ross, the Gordon Highlanders, the contingent prepared for the great occasion. This detachment came from Aden, from British Guiana, Jamaica, men from Gibraltar, from Malta, the George Cross Island, East and Central Africa, police from the West Indies, men from Tanganyika, Somaliland, Auxiliary Air Force from the Federation of Malaya and Singapore, and soldiers from Fiji. Police from Malaya, 4 of these men the proud wearers of the coveted George Medal for gallantry. A few days before the coronation, the contingent was honoured by a visit from His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, who inspected it and welcomed it to Britain. He spoke personally to many of the officers and men. On this occasion, the Duke was using the most up-to-date form of short-distance air transport, and his departure by helicopter was to the accompaniment of rousing cheers. At the garden party given by the Queen in the spacious and lovely grounds of Buckingham Palace, many visitors from her overseas territories were numbered among those invited to be present. As the Queen moved among her guests, shaking hands and chatting to several of them, none could fail to be impressed by her grace and charm. The Duke of Edinburgh was there also, and had many questions to ask the guests he met. And now the Queen talks with some of the other visitors from overseas. As Her Majesty and her party finally left her guests, there remained in the minds of all the memory of a thrilling and happy occasion. On the Sunday before Coronation Day, the Honourable Artillery Company, the oldest volunteer regiment in the British Army, acted as hosts to their fellow soldiers from overseas. It was a very friendly occasion, and everything was done to make the visitors feel thoroughly welcome. Some members of the regiment paraded in the uniforms and armour of several centuries ago, in which their predecessors had served the crown. A glorious sight, these pikemen, and a source of considerable interest to their guests. Apart from display parades, these uniforms are still worn by members who provide the escort for the Lord Mayor of London on all great occasions. When the great day itself arrived, many spectators had spent the previous day and night at vantage points along the processional route. Prince Charles, as you see, was awake very early, and from a window of the palace watched the carriages taking some of Her Majesty's royal guests to the Abbey. In the leading carriage were Her Majesty the Queen of Tonga and His Highness the Sultan of Kelantan. Then followed their Highnesses the Sultan and Sultana of Zanzibar and the Sultan of Perak. Behind them, their Highnesses the Sultan and Sultana of Johor and the Sultan of Brunei. Finally, their Highnesses the Sultan of Selangor and the Tengku Ampuan and the Sultan of Lahej. Facing Westminster Abbey on the site of the new colonial office, many seats had been reserved for visitors from the colonial territories. At last, the moment for which thousands of spectators had waited. Into the greyness of a rain-soaked morning comes the great gilded coach of state. Accompanied by her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, and looking quite radiant, the Queen leaves the palace, making her progress to Westminster on this, surely the greatest day of her life. To the vast multitude who watched and cheered, this spectacle formed a picture which they will remember as long as they live. As the state coach reaches Westminster Abbey, the Duke of Norfolk, Earl Marshal of England, waits to receive his sovereign. And now the Queen enters the Abbey, escorted by her 6 maids of honour who bear her train, and by her gentlemen-at-arms. Slowly Her Majesty moves into the theatre, where her mother, her sister, and peers of the realm, including her husband, are already assembled. The supreme moment of the ceremony is at hand as the Archbishop of Canterbury places the crown of St. Edward on the Queen's head. The peers don their coronets, and with a great shout, the Queen is acclaimed. The bells of the Abbey joyfully proclaim the great news to the waiting thousands. The Queen is crowned. Meanwhile, the great procession is already on its journey back to the palace, headed by the men from the overseas territories. The King's African Rifles, Somaliland Scouts. The Royal West African Frontier Force. Now the naval units. Following them, other Commonwealth contingents. From Westminster Abbey, the carriages of the Queen of Tonga and the Sultans again precede the state coach. Then follows the Queen's colonial escort. And behind it, the mounted escort from the Commonwealth contingents. Finally, Her Majesty enters the stagecoach to begin her triumphal drive over the processional route back to Buckingham Palace. Already the head of the procession has reached Hyde Park, which it enters through Apsley Gate. Again we see the colonial contingent marching in the lead. As they pass, we can identify them. In the front, the armed police. Behind them, the Air Force detachment, together with the Aden Protectorate levies. Then follow the volunteer forces. And now, easily distinguished by their white dress uniforms, the men of the Malay Regiment. They are followed by troops from East, Central and West Africa and by the naval units. The great stagecoach comes into view, the cheering swells to a roar. Despite the unpleasant weather, the procession makes a wonderful picture, and the British troops receive tumultuous applause as they march to the music of their bands. In due course, the stagecoach reaches the Mall and the last stage of its journey. To the cheers of the many thousands of spectators who have waited here throughout the day to welcome her, home again is the Queen in her gilded coach, approaching and entering now the gates of her palace. Presently, the Queen and her family appear on the balcony to acknowledge the overwhelming welcome of the waiting crowds. The roar of aircraft heralds the coronation salute and fly past by Air Force squadrons. Coronation Day is over, but the visitors are still in London. A special parade is held at the Cenotaph, where each of the rulers and a representative of each country lays a wreath in memory of those who fell in 2 world wars. Queen Salote of Tonga pays her tribute.